but
No worries at all. No worries at all. Yes, we can get going.
yes. All right. Well, I'm so delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be able to talk with students and also to the members of the public who may be here with us. This was a really fun book to write, really hard book to write, and I'm thrilled that you had an interest in reading it as a group, and I'd love to tell you more about it. So I thought I would spend about 10 minutes telling you a little bit about the background of the book, the origins of the story, um, maybe try to share a little bit with you about my research, and leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Along the way, I'll read a little bit, just so you get a little idea of the author's voice, how I hear Shelley's voice in my head, which I think may give you a little sense of how a writer approaches the work, and how we hear the voice, which you mentioned the audio book, and it's so different to hear someone else read it because I hear Shelley's voice very distinctly in my head in a particular way. But as you know, this is a book about a young man from China whose Western nickname is Shelley. The year is 2015. And he comes from a large family in an area in the southwest of China, in the province of Yunnan. He comes in the story, he comes to San Francisco to do three things. He wants to find a new family to join. He wants to find the great love of his life, to reconnect with her. And of course, he wants to make a lot of money. Um, he has this idea along the way that he has a kind of safety net, that he's going to be set up for success by what he considers, what he calls the Chinese groove. This is a Shelleyism. He's made up this idea. It's a kind of safety net for him, a kind of security blanket. He thinks wherever I go in the world, the people in the Chinese diaspora will be there for me, and they will not let me fail. And does it work for him? Are there truly unspoken bonds between countrymen that may lift us, support us, keep us from completely failing? Well, that's part of the fun of the story, and part of the suspense of the story is how is Shelley going to fare? So the story has its origins in a trip that I took to China with my parents quite a few years ago now. Actually, it was in 1999. My parents are both immigrants from China. My father was from the province of Yunnan. He's passed now, but he had been a young man who had come to study in the United States. He had a very different story than Shelley, and he's a very different person than Shelley. And he did not really serve as a model for the narrator of my novel. But he came from this area of China, not from the town that Shelley's from, but from a similar area. And uh, my father was taking, for the first time, he was going home to see his family. It had been many decades since my father was in his hometown, and I was really privileged to be able to accompany him and my mother and my brother on this trip. My dad had been back to China. China had been reopened for some time when we went in 1999, but he had actually not been back to his hometown because he lives in an area that's very close to the border of Vietnam. And even after China reopened to the West in 1973, 74, so he was unable to visit his hometown because the Chinese government didn't really want people there so close to Vietnam. So here we were going back to see his family. It was a really profound trip, as you can imagine. My father reuniting with his relatives. His siblings by then has passed. His parents had passed. He had left China as a young man and had never really seen his his uh, his close family again. But there were nieces and nephews and cousins. And one night we were at a family banquet. The family had an old family compound it was not habitable anymore, but there was an open courtyard. And I make reference in the novel to the Laoja, to the family compound. Well, my dad's family had this old dwelling, and the banquet was set up in the courtyard. It was pouring rain. There were tarps above our heads. It was a very dramatic scene, and all of the cousins were so gracious, and they were cooking dinner for us on these coal-fired little grates and barbecues set up under the tarps in this courtyard. My parents were the guests of honor, and they were seated at a table, a card table, sort of in the center of the area. And seated at their table was an older gentleman. He was clearly of my father's generation. He was there, he was present, he was smiling, he was nodding, he was enjoying the meal, but no one was speaking to him. No one was talking to him. In fact, it seemed to me as I observed the evening that they were really turning away from him. And I was so curious about who this person was. And I asked my father, um, who who was that man? Later back at the hotel, I said to my father, who was that man? Was he a relative? What's his story? And my dad really didn't want to say. The only thing he told me was he was the black sheep of the family. And that's all the story I could get out of him. That image stayed with me, the idea of someone who's both inside and outside of a family, someone who both has a role, has a seat at the table, but in some ways is kind of invisible to the other family, rest of the family. And I thought, actually, it's kind of an interesting metaphor for the idea of an immigrant in their new land, where they have a place in society, they might work, they might have a presence, but they're both inside and outside. They're both insider and outsider at the same time, and they're not fully visible, perhaps, to the mainstream society. That idea stayed with me until I decided one day to sit down and begin writing this novel. But when I went to write it was not the old man sitting at the card table next to my father that came to me. Instead, a very different kind of narrator presented himself, a young man, just 18 years old, sure of himself, funny, opinionated, aspirational, a little naive. Um, and that's the voice that I began hearing, and that's the beginning of the book. So I think I'll just read to you from the first paragraph, just so you get a little idea of how I hear Shelley's voice in my head. The relatives treated me rudely, beating me and calling me names. And so on my 18th birthday, my father buried his head in his hands and cried until the bottle was empty and his tears were spent, and he was at last decided it was time to let me go. Grubs like us didn't get many chances, and he had promised mother before she died that he would send me, their son and only child, away from this unhappy life and into a brighter world. There was an uncle, he said, conveniently rich, living in San Francisco. I should leave our home in Guizhou, Yunnan province, the most beautiful realm in all of China, and move in with uncle and figure out from there, foot in the door and student visa and green card and a score of other words. My father called out in the weeks that followed as I cleaned our shoes and boiled our broth and swept our single room, words that made no sense to me but ladled not an ounce of care into my black-haired head. I was all for the plan. Bathed in mother's dream for me, I'd been waiting for years to depart. I didn't want to be like my friends who were lined up to work at the beautiful World Crafts tin factory. Theirs wasn't the fate for me. My future lay outside those gates. For where in a factory could I become the man I intended to be, which was a cool guy and a poet? I told my father, yes. So that's Shelley's voice. And as we hear, he comes to San Francisco and he worms his way, as you know, for those who've read it, he worms his way into the lives of his American relatives. His Uncle Ted, Ted's white Jewish American wife, Aviva, and Ted's father, Henry. And they really want nothing to do with this young man. They don't know him. He's a stranger to them. Ted feels some obligation. He is a relative, but they put him up for a couple of weeks and then they sort of send him on his way. And Shelley has to figure out how to survive. Ted and Aviva have problems of their own. They're grieving a terrible loss. They're really lost themselves, and they don't want this extra bit of trouble, and they don't know what to do with him. But he is resourceful, and he's stubborn, and he's desperate because there's really no one in his corner. His father loves him and tries to do right by him, but his father too is so crushed by the loss of his wife some years earlier when Shelley was a child. His wife died of illness, that his father really isn't able to do much to help Shelley. And so it's the story, it's this interweaving of these lives. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I very much appreciate it. I very much appreciate that you could see the layering of the story of the drive forward for Shelley. He's a buoyant character. He's always in motion. He's got great dreams for himself, but he's very shadowed. He carries this burden of his father's grief, his own loss, and then he also has to confront the grief and the loss of his American relatives. So the story certainly looks at loss, at separation, at grief, and at some larger themes having to do with modern life in the city where I live, San Francisco. So it does look at questions of housing and home. How do we define home? What does it mean? And in my community in San Francisco, um, housing and the lack of affordable housing is an enormous issue for us. It's something that we all have feel the effects of, those housed and those unhoused. And so that very much runs through the book. And then, of course, the immigrant story, the love story, and a kind of picaresque novel, I would say, that uses both humor and serious themes to find its way. Now, I did quite a bit of research on the book. Now that I have switched computers, I'm not sure quite how I'm going to, give me a second to see if I can share my screen successfully. I wanted to share with you a few images from my research. As I said, I was very interested in the themes of home and housing. I was interested in the history of the Chinese American community in my city of San Francisco. When I'm working on a book, I do some initial research. I don't want to do too much research in the beginning because you can go down a lot of rabbit holes, especially with the internet. So I like to do some, so I get my bearings and then move out into the story. And then as I find questions arising or things that I'm curious about, then I'll stop. I use the library a lot. Of course, I use my share of the internet. But it helps me to have some visuals in mind. One of the big themes of the book, of course, is immigration, but there's another kind of traveling and displacement that interested me. And that is not only migration across international borders, but migration and movement within a city. So we have Shelley's American relatives whose their family line has done that also very big move from Chinatown, San Francisco, to a neighborhood on the western part of the city, which is called the Sunset District, where quite a few newly arrived immigrants eventually settled, and not just in the Chinese community, but Irish, Italian, Russian, South Asian, Central American now. And so this idea of how people move within a city interested me, and I did some research on that score as well. So forgive me just for a moment. I'm going to see if I can set myself up here to share a few slides with you. And once I get that settled, I will begin sharing my screen. That should be sharing now. There is a wonderful museum in San Francisco called the Chinese Historical Society of America. They are a small organization, but mighty. They do a lot of collection of records, documents, images of the early history of Chinese in the US. And right around the time I had not been working on the novel all that long, I had decided to set it in this neighborhood on the western side of San Francisco called the Sunset District. Right around the time I was working on the book, I discovered that the Chinese Historical Society of America was, in fact, presenting an exhibit, a traveling exhibit called Chinese in the Sunset. Sometimes when you're working on a book, you just get these gifts from Providence. And I was so excited. So I went to see this exhibit more than once. Here's one of the banners that was presented. And they told a number of wonderful stories about people who, as I said, left Chinatown or were newly arrived in the US and moved to this neighborhood. Now, the Sunset District is way to the western side of San Francisco. It's very foggy. It has very uniform housing. It was in its day, it was it was really developed by just a few housing developers who built affordable housing. It's not so affordable anymore, but in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it was more affordable. Here's a view of the outer Sunset District as it's seen on an unusually sunny day in the sunset. You can see that the streets are very regular. The houses are all very much the same size. And this was a photograph that was taken from that exhibit, Chinese in the Sunset District. So I would keep images like this. You'll see on the right-hand side of this photograph, you'll see a big swath of green. That's Golden Gate Park, and then we're looking straight out at the ocean. And we have a scene where Shelley and Kate walk down to Ocean Beach and walk together on the ocean, and that's where that blue would be. Now, although the developers made these homes very affordable and they were looking for new families to move in, when the area was first developed, there were restrictive covenants that kept out non-whites. They were legal at that time. This is a little bit earlier, 1916, than when Ted's relatives move out to the outer sunset. But here's an advertisement that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. A developer, 8 blocks of homes, nothing but homes. But by the way, no Africans or Asiatics wanted. So that was part of the history of San Francisco, the history of many cities in the United States, and certainly part of this area of the outer sunset. Eventually, federal law banned that kind of a restrictive covenant, but I wanted to make it part of my story. Here's a young man who very proudly is standing outside the family business. When I looked at these slides, I was delighted that his sign was red and white because I had already decided that the sign in front of Hung's grocery store that I had in my novel was also going to be red and white. There's a lot of small businesses in the outer sunset. People who left Chinatown and wanted to establish themselves in this part of the city would go out and start small grocery stores, laundries, shoe repair stores, small hardware stores, that kind of thing. And it's still a neighborhood that is much more small business oriented than large chains. I love this image, and it's one I looked at often as I wrote the book. Here's a family, Ed Tang's family in the 1950s. You see how hard they are working to assimilate into American society. The three children, the boys with the two matching sweaters, they've got their toy on the bottom, and this Christmas tree that you can barely see underneath the decorations, and the two little kids putting the ornaments on. And you know, this is the kind of family perhaps that Ted grew up in, or his parents, Henry and Diana were more of this vintage. This is a little bit too old, this family, for Ted's generation, but perhaps the older generation. And one of the reasons that I love this picture so much is, here's a photograph of my family in the 1950s. We seem to have the exact same Christmas tree, the spindly Christmas tree that's practically hidden under the weight of all the tinsel that my parents have hung on the tree. I'm the baby in that picture. My beautiful mom, my handsome dad, my siblings. So that's part of my story. I mean, the reason I set the book in the outer sunset was because part of my story is when my parents immigrated to the US, we lived in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in part in a place in Pennsylvania called Levittown. Much like Levittown, New York, Levittown, New Jersey, Levittown, Pennsylvania was an area, kind of a land of opportunity for newly arrived and for, you know, people on the GI Bill. If homes were small, but they were reasonably priced and people could get a foothold. This is just to urge you, if you come to San Francisco, to spend a little bit of time at the Chinese Historical Society of America, which, as I said, is a wonderful museum. And they're particularly, I think their collection of images are wonderful because they really capture that tension between the traditional family and traditional family values and people trying to make their way in a very different kind of society. So that's it on the research side. And I think I've been happy now to open it up to questions. What do you think, Megan? It's a good time?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect time, but maybe even before we do that, we would love to show you some appreciation. But you know, on Zoom, it can be kind of weird, right? Because you can't hear the clapping. So I would like folks to unmute yourself and actually let Kathryn hear a round of applause.
Oh, that's kind of you.
All right. Thank you. It's really so illuminating to hear about your research and see the research as well. I mean, like you said, the photographs are so evocative, and love to see a photo of your family as well. So we have some time for questions now. So as mentioned, if you would like to use the hand raise function, you're welcome to do that. You can unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can put your questions into the chat, and we will get to as many as we can within the time we have allotted. And maybe while we wait for some of those questions to roll in, you know, again, it's really interesting to hear about your research, especially about just some of the history from San Francisco. And I think I saw in an interview that you maybe interpreted this novel in a way as kind of like a love letter to California, right? We see Shelley travel, not just throughout, you said, you know, the migration movement within the city, but also, you know, sort of down the coast as well. So could you talk a little bit about maybe that aspect as well, the love letter to California?
Yes, I will. And you know, Shelley is bringing fresh eyes to this to the U.S., to San Francisco, to California at large. He's seeing it in a way that's wide-eyed and innocent, slightly naive, but also he's a truth teller. He sees things in ways that perhaps those of us who've lived here a long time no longer quite see. California, I'll say San Francisco, prides itself on being very multicultural, on being a very progressive city, but there are ways in which we don't always live up to our ideals. And the income disparity, the housing issues that I mentioned, um, the treatment of some recent arrivals. Uh, these are all places that are still places of tension in our city and certainly in our state. And so by having an outsider like Shelley comment on that, it gives us, it allowed me to have a slightly satirical edge in looking at, the way we present ourselves to the world and perhaps the reality of how we actually live. I hope not in a mean-spirited way, but maybe more in my aim was to do it in a more illuminating way that maybe also uses some humor to get the point across. There is irony in the book as given to us by Shelley, who's very excited to be here and has some outsized notions of what the US represents. He talks about this idea of peach blossom land. His father has always dreamt of a peach blossom land. The story of the peach blossom land is a very well-known legend in China. Every school child learns it. It was new to me. I didn't know it. I had never heard it before until I saw a play written by a really interesting playwright whose name is Stan Lai. And I saw this play actually in Ashland, Oregon at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. It's called Secret Love in Peach Blossom Land. And it was the first time I had been introduced to this legend of the peach blossom land, which is this idea of a kind of uh, beautiful, harmonious land where there is no conflict, everyone gets along, everyone has enough to eat, everyone has a place to live, a kind of Shangri-La. I mean, lots of different cultures have this idea, I think, of a sort of paradise outside of place and time. I asked my mom about it later. I said, "Oh, you ever heard this story, the Peach Blossom Land?" My mother looked at me like I was nuts. That'd be like one of my kids coming to me and saying, "Have you ever heard of this story, Cinderella?" I mean, that's how fundamental it is to children's education. But I loved the idea of pairing this notion, this metaphor of peach blossom, right? The land that we dream about. As Shelley has this dream of what he's going to find in the United States of America, and it comes up against reality. So that's one of the reasons why I use that motif, that whole idea of peach blossom. And California, I think, does still holds, it does for me still. And I've lived here for decades. I didn't grow up here. As I said, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, Levittown, and then other communities in Pennsylvania. But California to me still does have an aura of a peach blossom land. I mean, and in fact, my father always dreamt of being in California because he grew up in Yunnan, which is this very beautiful temperate area of China that has a climate similar to California, even though for years my parents lived in Ohio and then Pennsylvania. My dad really wanted to eventually get to California, and eventually he moved the family here. Um, so that is, I think California plays that role in this book of being a kind of Shangri-La, a sort of peach blossom land that falls short of that dream.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, sometimes you need that outside perspective to shine a light on some of the certain things we tend to overlook. As someone, I was born and raised in San Diego, so it's always interesting for me to get that different perspective and see things, like you said, through fresh eyes.
Yeah, but there's also a theme running in the book of family, like, and home. Where is home? What is home? Who is home? What is family? And Henry and Ted, they have this persistent conflict. They've never really understood each other. And are there ways in which we can choose family, find a different family? Shelley's going out. He wants to get away from the mean relatives. He's looking for a new family to join. And Henry, interestingly, also is seeking a kind of different family and a different community. So Henry finds that in Southern California. He leaves, he finds a whole new community. So you wouldn't think of the old guy as being the one who has the chosen family, but in this book, because things are turned upside down on their head, it is Henry who goes in search of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that subversion too of the kind of, the family dynamic. All right, we've got some great questions pouring in the chat. I do see Warren has a hand up. Warren, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. First of all, thank you for taking the time to do this. It's really cool to see you talk about the book. Um, I'm in the process of querying a novel, and several of the agents that are expressing interest in the manuscript have worked with Counterpoint Press a lot. And then you say in the acknowledgments at the end of the Chinese Groove that you bounced high with happiness on the day the book found a home at Counterpoint. Um, I was just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that and why you were so excited to be with Counterpoint, and I guess what your experience was in the process of publishing this book with them.
Sure. Congratulations, Warren, on having something that you're working on seriously, because it's a big lift, and I applaud you for having that dream of your own, and for tackling it. I have had a very fine experience. I have a wonderful editor there whose name is Dan Lopez. And a wonderful publisher, Dan Smetana, and it's been a great experience. They're not a they're they're not a large New York house, and in that way, I think I've just had a wonderful experience of having a very personal relationship with all the people who shepherded the book. Editors make a huge difference in making a book better. I mean, we talked, when you talk about process, it's a lot to write a novel. It's a big baggy thing. There's so many choices to make. It goes through so many iterations, and you bring it as far as you can on your own, maybe with the help of your writing group, or the writers to whom you show work. And then it's very helpful to have a good editor who will bring another. We talk about Shelley's fresh perspective, Shelley's fresh eyes. That's what an editor will do for a manuscript. They'll bring a fresh set of eyes and push you, hold your feet to the fire to make it better. And all of my editors with all of my books have done that in collaboration with me. So it's been a positive experience. Good luck.
Thank you. We appreciate that insight. And I know there's some other students here who are getting to that point too. So it's great to hear about that journey, the journey to publication. There were some other questions in the chat about your kind of personal journey to become an author. So there was one thing from your bio that I didn't want to mention in the initial introduction because I wanted to save it for the Q&A. Is that you kind of had maybe a different pathway in that you started for several years as a practicing attorney. So how did you find your way to the page? Does your past experience as an attorney influence your writing currently? Tell us a little bit about that, your journey.
Yes, I guess I'm a slow developer. I'm a late bloomer. I had always been a really avid reader. I loved reading my whole life. But when it came time to choose a major in college and think about what I wanted to do, writing was not on the table for me. I couldn't conceive of myself as wanting to try writing. I don't know what it was. It was partly lack of imagination on my part, and partly the family that I was from. My parents, as I said, were first generation American. They worked incredibly hard in their professions, and the idea that I was going to go to them and say that I wanted to become a novelist seemed sort of ludicrous. So I did I was good. I loved language. Um, and I love to read, and I like to talk. So I thought, well, I'll become a lawyer, and I did. I practiced law for 12, 13 years. And I really actually enjoyed it quite a bit. I especially liked the teamwork. I was in a law firm in San Francisco, and I really liked having colleagues and, working toward common goals. But around the time I was in my mid 30s, I really began to get that. I actually had started to do a little writing when I was in law school, a little fiction writing. I was writing short stories, I was writing a few essays, I was sending stuff out slowly. But I always knew I wanted to be a novelist. I mean, because I love the form of the novel so much. So by the time I was in my mid 30s, I was starting to think, maybe there's something here. Maybe I can do this. I'd gotten some good feedback on the stories that I'd submitted. Nothing was getting published, but I was getting some good rejection notices. So finally, at age 39, I screwed up my courage and I left my law career. I realized it was just going to be super hard to try to become a writer and practice law full time and raise a family. It was just too much. So with my husband's incredible support, and given that I had, put so many years into a legal career, and so had made enough money to contribute something to my family's well-being, I stopped. I did think about getting an MFA. I had a really good teacher in a night, in an extension class at San Francisco State University, where I took a writing class at night, and he said, if you go for the MFA, you will get to where you want to go probably faster, and you'll have more contacts, and you'll give you some structure. But in the end, I decided I decided not to do it that way. I decided to do it on my own. The one thing I did, one of the best things I did for myself, was I got a little office outside my house. By then I had a family, I had children, and I just thought, if I try to learn how to do this from the home, I'll just, there'll always be another load of laundry to put in. So I left the house every day while the kids were at school, and I just had a little workspace, and I sat in there and began writing. And it's taken me a long time. I mean, I've been very humbled by the whole process. Because when I was a lawyer, I could write a brief really fast. I mean, a really new language. I could assemble something quickly, and writing a novel is a whole different experience. But I'm glad I did it, and I love it. And I'm working on a new novel now. And I miss being a lawyer at times, but there's really only room in my life for two. I don't think I can do another pivot at this point, so I got to keep going.
Well, hey, it's never too late. And I feel like if you have that voice, right, you said that kind of itch, it never goes away unless you address it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yes.
yes. You will never know. You will never know unless you try. You never know unless you try. Yeah, there'd always be that question. Just as if I had started out as a writer, and I would always wonder, was this really what I should be doing with my life? I mean, well, I think that's just my personality. So I'm glad that I've done both, but I'm really glad that the writing came second. And it took me 10 years to write the stories in my first collection. It really took me a long time to learn my craft. And I was very humbled by it. I wrote 2 novels along the way in that first 10 years, 10, 12 years. I wrote 2 novels that have not been published. And I wrote the stories in the collection. Collection was published. Then I wrote the first novel that was published the year, then The Chinese Groove. So a lot of writing is sitting in a file drawer. That's part of the learning.
Yeah, well, I think that's just part of the life too, right? There's with every published author, there's at least a couple manuscripts sitting in a file somewhere or in a desk somewhere.
It all goes into the hopper, and it's none of it is a waste of time. It truly is not. It all teaches you something. And readers teach me so much. Oh my goodness, meeting readers as I go about, talking to book clubs or talking to students as we are this evening. I learn so much from readers about what interests them in a book, what characters they're drawn to, what holds their attention, what they get impatient with, and how they approach a work of literature. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. Well, speaking of characters, there's a couple questions about our dear Shelley in the chat. And there's a good one from Hibba who wanted to know, did assigning Shelley a male gender play a significant role in the direction you wanted the novel to go? Do you think the novel would have been shaped differently if Shelley was a woman?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I think, I'm a deep believer in the subconscious, that the subconscious guides the writer without the writer even being aware. It never occurred to me that the main character of this book would be anything other than a young man. And I wanted to make the book about fathers and sons. And that's why, the book has resonances with this pairing of father and son, Henry and Ted, Shelley and his father. They are they're by having two sets of fathers and sons, we see parallels between them and differences. But I think it has to do with that choice to write about a young man had in part to do with this image of this older relative of my father's, who I had seen at the table, who was visible but invisible at the same time. And we have Shelley, who's often standing in a doorway in the book. He's often like halfway in and halfway out of the room, until the very end of the book, not the very last chapter, but the final scene where the baby naming. See, he's fully in the room now. He's finally joined. Um, so that's part of the reason I think that it went into being a young man. But then also, my daughter is also a writer, and she was one of my conversation partners for one of the book events I did for this novel. She lives in New York City, and we were doing a book event at a wonderful bookstore in Chinatown in New York City called You and Me Books, YU and Me Books, run by a woman named Lucy Yu. And my daughter asked me, one of the first questions she asked me was, don't you think you wrote this book because your father was like Shelley's age, or a little bit older than Shelley when he first came to the US? And I was just astonished. I mean, I was dumbfounded. It never occurred to me. It had never occurred to me that that actually was an impetus for the book, for my choosing to write about a young man. But looking back now, long after the novel was published, I suppose so. She could see into my soul better than I could. I suppose so. So I think, inspiration for books, the origin of a story, whether it's a novel or a short story or a memoir piece, these things are mysterious. They come to us in ways that we might not be able to track, but they're all worth exploring.
Well, yeah, I guess again, you just needed the kind of fresh eyes to tell you where these ideas came from too, right?
Yeah.
Well, we talked a lot about the family dynamic, especially the kind of parallels with the father-son. But we also talked a lot about just the approach, I mean, the structure in terms of storytelling, how there's almost the meta aspect in which Shelley is telling us as the readers and makes addresses to us as, the readers. Shelley is a storyteller. So Isabel was kind of wondering in the chat, she says, storytelling, especially fictional storytelling, is a theme common throughout the novel. Shelley's father tells stories to his dying mother, falsehoods about his day to make her feel better. Shelley in turn tells his father these kinds of stories about his own life in the US to keep him from worrying. Does Shelley's optimistic demeanor result from telling himself these stories too?
Ah, what a wonderful. See, I think that is what I said. I always learn something from readers. I hadn't actually thought about I mean, storytelling is a very chosen theme of the book. I hadn't actually thought about Shelley telling himself stories. I mean, I mentioned that he tells himself the Chinese groove is going to save him. And right away, he makes a mistake right in the beginning. He's on the plane to the US and he's handed a can of soda, and the guy tells him, no, no, it's free. And Shelley thinks, oh, the Chinese groove is saving me. And we, the reader, know right away no, dude, you got this wrong. Everybody gets a free soda on the plane. So we're immediately, we're heightened our awareness that he could be getting himself into trouble. So I think that you're right that Shelley has a sort of, he does have the ability to delude, to self-delude, which is a kind of defense mechanism, a kind of survival mechanism for him. But I loved, I love the idea of using storytelling. It was generated by this idea of having the legend of the Peach Blossom Forest run through the book, and also by the fact that I think, ironically, sometimes the people we have the hardest time communicating with are the people we love the most. So families have so much trouble talking to each other, communicating clearly, honestly, to sharing their heart. Sometimes it's easier with strangers even, or friends. And stories, I think, are a way that families can talk to one another. Through stories like recounting a story of what's happening to a friend of one's, for example, or talking about a movie that you saw together, a TV show, or a book that you've enjoyed. It's through that sharing of stories that we are really communicating something else, perhaps, to our family members that we can't seem to bring ourselves to say. So that's where that idea of storytelling comes from. But also, I mean, I'm really interested in the theater. I love going to live performances, to plays. And there is a particular play about halfway through writing this book, I suddenly realized, oh, I think this book is a kind of a version of that play, Servant of Two Masters by Carlo Goldoni. So I don't know if you know that play, but it's in the play, there's a servant who he ends up having to work for two different people. And he's running back and forth between these two masters. It was later made into a modern adaptation called One Man, Two Governors, which is hilarious if you ever get a chance to see it. And it, it, it worked because I began writing Shelley and I wanted to be a somewhat comic character. I had this idea of that, you talk about images in your mind. I had that idea of that circus performer who's got long poles and the plates are spinning on top of the pole, and he's running back and forth between the plates and keeping those plates spinning. And that was Shelley. And then I realized, oh, that's sort of the servant of two masters, who's a character who's running from pillar to post and trying to keep everybody happy. And there's a kind of, in that play, he has to just keep making up stories for in each incident, and covering his tracks and making excuses, and being as resourceful as he can. So that also is part of the storytelling aspect of the book.
Well, certainly, yes, there's lots of sources of inspiration that you culled for this book. And you had mentioned at when you had started talking about Shelley as a character, right, the Chinese groove, which is a Shelleyism, which I love we loved all the Shelleyisms throughout the course of the novel. And I know, what a wonderful way to develop his character as well. But there was a question, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the Chinese groove. And Kate was wondering, do you think that other immigrant cultures can have their own version of the Chinese groove, or is it distinctly related to Chinese culture?
Kaylin, I think you're absolutely right. I think many communities have their own version. It's not even necessarily tied to an ethnicity or a race or. I mean, how many times have you been to a concert and the performer up on stage is like, is anybody out there from Philly, from Cleveland? And you hear some cheer in the back of the, people identify, people feel a bond with strangers if there's some connection, something in common. And it can be both a support, a kind of comfort, a connection, but it also can be a it can be something of a trap, or it can be something of a false floor, I think. But I do think it exists.
in many communities and in many ways. And it's called different things in different communities, but particularly among immigrant communities, I think people recognize that idea that someone's going to give me a hand, you know, where we're gonna look out for each other. And the character of Huntington, the corrupt politician, is a sort of shiv in the side of the Chinese groove, right? We want him to be a good guy. We want him to be on the same, moving in the same direction as Shelley and Henry and Ted. And we want these people to feel bound to one another and to sort of share ambition and try to better their community. But of course, there's no monolithic community. And the idea of this political figure who is just in it for himself, not in it for his community at all, provides a counterbalance to that idea of the Chinese groove.
Yeah, I think his character functioned as a wonderful foil, I think, in the novel. And I was wondering, you know, name all the names. Was this character based on anybody, you know, in particular? Was this a pastiche of these types of individuals?
I think pastiche, we have our share of politicians making some really dumbass moves in San Francisco, and I'm sure you do in San Diego, and you know every community has got its share of people just being foolish and maybe not thinking through. So yeah, no one in particular, but there have been a few examples, and that's one. You know, that was a plot point that was fun to work out. That was the lawyer brain in me. I mean, and I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but having practiced law for so many years, I still do think of things sometimes from a legal point of view, and I can get a little too. This is where an editor comes in, Warren. I can get a little too hung up on the technicalities, and in this case, you know, I was trying to get across this idea of a politician, you know, lying to the community, committing fraud essentially on the voters. But I had to try to do it in a way that didn't get too far down into the weeds.
Right, yes, we don't want to border on a possible book ban, you know, for ridiculous reasons. So there was we have time for a couple more questions. There was a question from Linda about the cover. She complimented the beautiful red cover, was wanting to know if you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh God, I'm just so thrilled with the cover. When, you know, when my first book came out, which was this collection of stories, which had won a very prominent prize from the University of Iowa Press, they said to me, what do you think about for cover, Kathryn? I said, oh, please, just no teacups, no fans, no headless women in Mandarin collar dresses. I mean, when you are a writer that comes from a minority community, they're often putting things on the cover of your book that are sort of identifiably to your community, to your racial identity or ethnic identity or sexual orientation, whatever it is. They kind of want to, you know, label you in some way. And as a novelist and as a writer, I'm proud of being Chinese American writer. I'm certainly proud of being a woman writer, but I don't want to infringe on my characters' lives and put them in any kind of box. So I was just thrilled that this was the cover, one of the covers that was previewed to me. The publisher, when you publish a book, the publisher has the ultimate say in what the cover is. The writer is usually shown, I think, in many cases, it's always been my experience that the writer is shown options and you can have some input. The designer of this cover, the artist, is a woman named Na Kim, who is an extraordinary artist and cover artist. She's done a lot of book covers. You might know that book, Crying in H Mart. That was her cover. And you can sort of see she has a particular style where she's got very simple lines. Crying in H Mart is a kind of, there's sort of a noodle. I don't know if you remember that cover. It's a face, but there's kind of a noodle, suggestion of a noodle. And she's done a number of other covers that you all would recognize. And so it was a great honor to have her do the cover art. And I was very happy. I mean, one of the things that made me so happy about this cover is that this figure here of this human figure going up the stairs is just catching air. Like he's not actually touching the stairs. he's flying up the stairs, and he's got his sort of his arm, you know, he's got momentum, and he's got forward. He's looking to the future.
It feels very Shelley-esque.
Yes, it does, without being literal.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a great concluding question in the chat here from Lewis. You know, I think there can be the myth of the writer who just sits alone and, you know, types away in their basement and never has any interaction with people. But I think it's really important for writers to find community. And so Lewis wanted to know, what would you say is the most important aspect a writer should focus on when developing a found family, like you did for the characters around Shelley?
Do you think that question has to do with the found family in the writing community, fellow writers?
I think, yeah, an important aspect a writer should focus on when developing a found family.
Okay. Yeah. It's a really apt question for me in particular because I entered the field of writing. Because I did do it by myself for so many years. I did get this little office, but it was just me in the office. It took me a long time to find my people. It took me a long time to have the time and the space to go out into the world and try to find other writers. There is a wonderful writing community, a kind of a co-op here in San Francisco called the Writers Grotto. You probably have some similar organizations in the San Diego area. And it's a group of writers who got together and had rented some space together for a while. It has existed physically as a group. It's also been virtual at times. It's been through different iterations. But I joined for a while, and through the Writers Grotto, I began to meet other writers. Ultimately, when I really began to focus on the form of the novel, I had to change the way that I began to share my work, because I found that it was not that useful to share the writing of a novel 20 pages at a time or 25 pages at a time. It's such a big thing, and to only share a scene or two at a time just wasn't quite working for me. So with some friends who are very fine novelists and writers, we developed a group that we call the WBG, which stands for the Whole Book Group. And our commitment to one another is that when you have a manuscript of the entire novel, we will read the entire manuscript for each other, and we'll read it as soon as we can, because it's agony for a writer to finish something and then wait for feedback. So when someone in the WBG has finished a novel manuscript, you pass it around and everybody else tries to read it within 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks at the most, and then we meet and we give feedback. We don't meet very often because it takes a long time to write a novel, but we're there for one another. And that found community, that found family of writers has been enormously important to me. And the other place where I have found community is in reading. I have belonged to a book group for over 40 years now. It's people I went to law school with, all wonderful readers. I'm the only writer in the group. we started reading books together really just out of graduate school. Who knew that we were going to still be doing it together 40 years later? In fact, nobody even kept a list of the books we read, because we had no idea we were going to last 40 years. We tried to recreate our bibliography on our 20th anniversary. So now we're a little bit more organized about that. But it's been tremendously important to me as a writer to have a serious reading community. So I think even if you're not writing and sharing, and that's not a place where you are yet in your development as a writer, I think having a reading community, people that we have a consistent, a consistent circle of friends with whom you're reading work, or published work, it can help you develop your ear. It can help you find out what your taste is. It can help you develop your sensibility as a writer. And it's just been tremendously important to me to have that group. So I'm very grateful to them.
Yeah, I think in order to become, or to try to become, a good writer, you have to at first be a great reader. So what a beautiful suggestion, and just wonderful that 40 years, that's an accomplishment.
It's amazing to me. And we just celebrated it. We just had a 40th anniversary party, and we read a marvelous novel by a Sri Lankan writer. The novel is called The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida. And there's a scene in the novel toward the end of the novel where the hero, protagonist, it's a hero's journey sort of novel. He is ushered into a room and he sits at a long table, and there are 5 different drinks on the table in 5 different vessels. And he has to choose among these drinks, and whatever he chooses is going to determine his next phase of existence. And at our anniversary party, we had this array of the 5 drinks in the 5 vessels, and we all had to make our choice. So the books that we've read have, become part of our living, of our life. It's a wonderful way to see the world. The amazing thing is, at this point, because we have committed to one another and kept at it, at this point, we have read hundreds of books in common. How often does that happen, where you've read hundreds of books in common with a group of people? So it's like having a mobile library, right? It's like always having a library with you when you see these friends, because we can always refer back to books that we read. We remind ourselves. Everybody forgets what they read too. So different people remember different things. I would say, to me, one of the most important parts of writing is the reading. I agree with you.
Well, I feel like I need to score an invite. How can I get an invite to one of these book meetings? They sound pretty fun. I mean, drinks, all of the shared knowledge. Sign me up, please, Kathryn. Sign me up. All right. Well, at the risk of becoming zombies, I think we can conclude there. Let's thank Kathryn again. If you can unmute yourself, let her hear your gracious applause. We so appreciate your time and insight, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Markel, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you again. And we are going to keep an eye out for the new novel, and, the best of luck and wishes in finishing that and making it come to fruition. And we're going to keep an eye out.
Great.
All right. Thank you again, Kathryn. And thank you all. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I would say get home safely, but hopefully y'all are already home. But if not, thank you again. And Kathryn, lovely to meet you virtually. I hope we get to see you in person someday too.
Very much hope for the same.
All right.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.